Now, Donald Trump is not a fan of the press. Everybody knows this. And he has done outrageous things in attacks against the press. He's tried to get a CNN reporter fired. Obviously, he went after Megyn Kelly on Fox News, saying she's bleeding from wherever. And then saying, oh, well, yeah, you're a pervert if you think I meant anything else, you know. Yeah, Donald, we know what you meant. It's not that complicated. Then he went after a New York Times reporter who actually has a congenital condition. And so he moves his arms in an awkward way because he has a condition I could barely pronounce, arthrogryposis. So now, I've never seen a presidential candidate do this. So before, he mocked that guy doing this.
Written by a nice reporter. Now the poor guy, you got to see this guy. Oh, I don't know what I said. Oh, I don't remember. He's going like, I don't remember. Oh, baby, that's what I said.
Oh, Jesus Christ, man. You know what's amazing about that is that his fans look at that and go, oh, mocking a disabled person, that's awesome. What are you going to do? You know, he thought maybe we should put ID badges on Muslims, maybe on disabled people too. Now, this is a New York Times reporter, and he's a guy who had originally written for the Washington Post that there were possibly some Muslims celebrating after 9/11, that the FBI was looking into that. Now, when asked about it, he said, look, I don't remember exactly what the details were, but there's certainly not hundreds or thousands of Muslims celebrating as Donald Trump is claiming, so Donald Trump does that to him. And then afterwards he says, oh, no, I don't remember the particular guy. Really? You did that with your arms and you don't remember what he does with his arms? Of course, it turns out that guy has been writing about Donald Trump for decades, and Donald Trump has seen him many times. This guy's a notorious liar. But if you're a liar, what are you going to do? Well, you don't want the people to bring you the truth. You want to attack them. It's like the oldest trick in the book for Republicans. You attack anyone bringing you knowledge or facts. Reporters, professors, scientists, and Donald Trump does that to a T. In fact, he's not taking it to a new level. He was asked on Morning Show, hey, Vladimir Putin says he likes you. Isn't that problematic given that he kills political opponents and reporters? And he said, well, he's at least a strong leader. What on God's green earth? How is this guy winning? I mean, I know I've said it before, he's the id of the Republican Party, and the Republican Party likes id. That's their favorite part of the brain, if any part of the brain is being used at all. So, but now Donald Trump has gone on this weird tangent about killing reporters. And so he's at a rally, and he's going to talk about it like, that's a legitimate debate. I mean, he's doing it kind of tongue-in-cheek, but then he points out the reporters, they're in the back. They literally keep them in a cage and then release them. So he's kind of pointing back there, and then the crowd starts taunting. So take a look at it for yourself.
And then they said, you know, he's killed reporters. And I don't like that. I'm totally against that. By the way, I hate some of these people, but I'd never kill them. I hate them. No, these people, honestly, I'll be honest. I would never kill them. I would never do that. Let's see. No, I wouldn't. I would never kill them. But I do hate them, and some of them are such lying, disgusting people. It's true. It's true. It's true. But I would never kill them, and anybody that does, I think would be despicable. But, you know, nobody said, they say he killed reporters. I said, really? He says he didn't. Other people say he didn't. Who did he kill? Well, we don't know, but we hear that. I said, tell me, who did he kill?
By the way, he's defending Putin there. It's like, yeah, some people say he killed reporters and Putin says he didn't. So obviously I trust Vladimir Putin. Okay, nice judgment there. But to the heart of the issue now, about the press. Okay, look, I'm not unaware that he seemed to be kidding, but it's not a thing you kid about. And, should we kill him? And then the crowd's cheering like, yeah, kill him. And attacking him, I hate him. All this incredibly strong language against the press. He's got a giant American flag behind him. At one point, in fact, at many points in that speech, again, there were protesters. They were removed from the building as the crowd chanting, USA, USA. As he's attacking freedom of the press, which is at the core of American values. It reminds me of an old Star Wars movie where of course, they mention, you know, freedom being lost to thunderous applause. And that's basically what's happening here in the Trump rallies. Now, look, he's still got a solid lead on the Republican side, and you know, I read some old school articles that were talking about what happened in Germany back in the day when Hitler came to power. Now, I know what some of you think, oh, you can't make that comparison. But it's really instructive because the number one thing people say is, one, we didn't think he was really going to win, and Hitler didn't win, but he maneuvered his way into leadership anyway. It's not like that hasn't happened before in America. And then the overwhelming thing that everybody said was, we didn't really think he was going to do it. And what is the thing that everybody's telling us now? I mean, Trump kids around about killing reporters. He's very serious about how much he hates them, loathes them, and attacks them all the time. But he's not really going to do it, is he? He talks about how he's going to ban all Muslims from the country. He's going to make them wear ID badges. He's not really going to do it, is he? He says that he's going to take 11 million, 12 million immigrants in this country from Latin America and remove them and their families and march them out of the country and throw them out. He's not really going to do it, is he? Back in the day, they thought, well, he's not really going to do any of those things. Well, here's Donald Trump saying, well, let's have a conversation. I mean, I guess we shouldn't kill him. Probably not, but we should really hate the press. That's about as un-American a thing as you can say. You can criticize the press all day long. I criticize the press. I criticize the press to make them better, not to destroy them. The right wing wants to destroy them so that you can't get any information to counter their propaganda. And the king of that is Donald Trump. And now we've taken it to an extremely ugly level. And people are still joking around like, don't worry about it, crazy Donald Trump. He's not really going to do it. Is he?